Hey everybody, News Now Wyoming again. I'm going to bring part of the cross-exam that I think is the most damning part of the Lieutenant Zimmerman's main statements here. This, I think, will go on for about 10 minutes. I'll try not to interrupt it, but I think that this examination was amazing. And again, I don't think Mr. Nelson really ruined it in the cross-examination at all. So let's get started on. All right.
Just a reminder, you're still under oath.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor. Lieutenant Zimmerman, I want to draw your attention back to the incident on May 25th of 2020.
Yes.
Earlier, you told the jurors about being at the scene, finishing your work there. The next day, did you have an opportunity to review some video of that incident?
Yes.
And do you recall what that video, where you saw it?
Yes.
And was it the, we've been calling the Darnella Frazier video?
Yes.
Did you watch that video in its entirety?
Yes, I did.
And since then, have you had an opportunity to watch other video of the incident?
Yes.
And specifically, have you watched body-worn camera video of the incident from the involved officers?
Yes.
And based on that and your years of training and experience with the Minneapolis Police Department, you saw then Officer Chauvin with his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, correct?
Yes.
Would you call what you saw there a use of force?
Yes.
And did that use of force continue until the ambulance arrived?
Yes, it did.
Was there any change in the level of force being used until the ambulance arrived?
No.
And what do you think about that use of force during that time period?
I'm sorry?
What do you think about that use of force during that time period?
A little vague. Could you limit it to the time frame?
Right. Okay. So, based on your review of the body-worn camera videos of the incident,
Yes.
and directing your attention to that moment when Mr. Floyd is placed on the ground,
Yes.
what is your view of that use of force during that time period?
Totally unnecessary.
What do you mean?
Well, first of all, pulling him down to the ground, face down, and putting your knee on the neck for that amount of time is just uncalled for. I saw no reason why the officers felt they were in danger, if that's what they felt. And that's what they would have to feel to be able to use that kind of force.
Okay, and for me, this is exactly what I've been saying from the very beginning of this. Possibly the knee on the neck, I will never agree with being a reasonable use of force. However, others strongly disagree with that. So, okay, I'll concede. Let me just concede that point. The knee on the neck for a minute to get somebody restrained and in handcuffs. Okay, let's call that reasonable use of force. Continued use for 9 minutes. Is that reasonable? After you were told 4 minutes before that, hey, he's not responding at all, he has no pulse and stuff like that. When does that turn unreasonable? Or is it always reasonable?
So, in your opinion, should that restraint have stopped once he was handcuffed and prone on the ground?
Absolutely.
And I should add to that question then, also that it appeared he had stopped resisting.
I'm sorry?
And it appeared that he had stopped putting up any resistance.
Absolutely, I would stop.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
So really nice short clip there. Just him giving his opinion as a 40-year veteran of the police department. I think it does hurt the defense a lot. And the defense doesn't actually do a lot in there to overturn that. But I will go ahead and we'll play some of that cross-examination I actually missed earlier. So let me pause this video and we'll come back. Okay, so, oh, why did that happen again? Okay. We're going to go ahead and play a little bit of this cross-examination now.
And I'm assuming that in the last, well, since 1993, and you were promoted to sergeant, you've handcuffed some people in that time frame.
I have.
Right. When's the last time you got in a physical fight with a person?
About in 2018.
Okay, so it's been a couple of years since you've been in a physical fight with a person.
Yes.
All right. And so you would agree that the use of force as an investigator is, or the higher levels of force as an investigator is less likely than a patrol officer.
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question.
I'll rephrase it. The frequency with which you have to use higher levels of force as an investigator doesn't happen all that often, right?
Correct.
And so your experience generally as a use of force or involving the use of force is primarily in this annual what's called defensive tactics training, right?
Yes.
And the defensive tactics training is one of the requirements you need to use or to complete in order to maintain your license as a police officer, right?
Yes.
And you would agree that, or I'm presuming that since 1985 until the present day, tactics have changed as a police officer.
Some tactics have changed, yes.
Right. And
So we're going to skip
it's fair
some
to
of
say
this
that you
here.
are not another police officer. You would agree, however, that roughly 10 years ago, the Minneapolis Police Department kind of moved away from trying to hit people to control them and started using body weight to try to control people.
I don't think I would agree with that.
Okay, so you think that, I mean, within the arsenal, so to speak, of a police officer, it's as common to punch or strike someone in the use of force as it is to just use what are called takedown moves or body weight pins.
Yes.
Okay, and that's, I'm presuming that your understanding of the use of force involves the Minneapolis Police Department policies on the use of force, right?
Yes.
And the Minneapolis Police Department policies are designed, at least based on your understanding, to address the legal requirements for the use of force.
Yes.
And so there are factors, correct, to determine whether or not a use of force is proportional, reasonable, things of that nature, right?
Correct.
And what we look at in any particular case is the totality of the circumstances. Agreed?
Yes.
So there's lots of different information that a police officer has to use in order to determine the level of force to be used under which circumstances.
Yes.
Agreed?
Yes.
Now, in terms of the Minneapolis Police Department, are you familiar with the Minneapolis Police Department's critical thinking or critical decision-making model?
Yes.
And you would agree, I'm assuming again, based on a long career, that an officer is constantly taking in new information, and that information will affect the decisions he or she makes, right?
That's correct.
And would you also agree that the training that you received initially as a police officer is probably a lot different than the academy now?
Yes.
Obviously, the available tools that officers have are a lot different today than they were in 85, 90, 95.
Yes,
Body cameras, they didn't exist when you first became a police officer.
that's correct.
Tasers were not a thing either, right?
No,
You carried a gun and some handcuffs and kind of old school cop, right?
yes,
Now, in terms of the decision making of a police officer, would you agree that there are certain pieces of information that that officer has that affect his or her decisions on the use of force?
yes,
And some of that information is very immediate, kind of low-level information. Agreed?
yes,
So, for example, what just happened with this particular suspect, right?
yes,
Is this suspect under the influence of a controlled substance, or is he sober,
yes,
right? What are you looking at in that moment through your own eyes, right?
yes,
That's the officer's experience in any situation, right?
right,
You look at other things that may be hazards or threats in the immediate vicinity, correct?
So I wanted to point this out because you could see exactly where Mr. Nelson's going with his defense of Mr. Chauvin in this case. You can see where he's wanting to take the case and all of the different things that may have impacted Officer Chauvin of why it might be reasonable for him to have made these moves. So I can see where he's going here as much as I disagree with him. So let's go ahead and continue.
yes,
So you're going to assess, are there people watching? Are there people videotaping? Are those people happy or angry, etc., right?
yes,
You're going to look at what we would refer to as scene security, right?
yes,
You have a responsibility as a police officer for your partners who may be close to you, right?
yes,
You have a responsibility as a police officer for all of the people in the immediate area, right?
yes,
And so scene security is kind of trying to keep it as tight as possible and keep everybody in the area safe. Agreed?
that's correct, everybody.
In turn, you were asked a series of questions about your an officer's medical responsibilities.
I'm sorry,
I said, you were asked a series of questions about your medical training and an officer's medical, what they're supposed to do.
Okay, so here, of course, they're going to take, he wants to fight against that level of care that an officer is supposed to have, somebody underneath their control. So were the officers required to provide first aid to Mr. Floyd while he was unconscious? Were they supposed to help resuscitate him? Or was it appropriate to keep the knee on the neck until he died?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And even in the assessment of a medical emergency, there are many factors that come into that assessment, correct?
yes,
To your knowledge, Minneapolis police officers they're trained medically at a fairly low level. They're not paramedics, doctors, etc.
that's correct,
You're a first responder.
yes,
Basically, you're taught how to apply tourniquets, patches for gunshots, stop bleeding, basic CPR, and resuscitative efforts, right?
that's correct,
A police officer's job primarily is to keep the scene safe. Agreed?
I'm sorry,
A police officer's responsibility is to keep the scene secure and safe. Agreed?
yes,
Minneapolis police policy requires the involvement of a higher level of medical intervention if the circumstances dictate, correct?
yes,
And an officer is required, if someone is having a medical emergency, to take what steps they're able to reasonably in the moment, right?
yes,
And that would include potentially calling EMS.
that's correct,
But then, so you've got all of these immediate factors, right, that come into play. But then you can kind of widen that lens a little bit, and there are some other factors.
So I've got an issue issue with that, again, where he's going with this. You take into account the crowd. Is the crowd unruly? Is the crowd getting worse? Yes, the crowd is getting more and more angry the longer you keep your knee on his neck until he dies. When they see that the guy is no longer moving, he's no longer breathing, and they can tell that he's no longer breathing, the crowd gets extremely upset. So why do you, to control the scene, just keep your knee on the neck? Why is that the appropriate response? Giving him care would have calmed that crowd down. Turning him over, sitting him up, or giving compressions, anything would have calmed that crowd down. And so why is the appropriate answer to an angry crowd to keep doing exactly what you are doing in killing a man? You guys can tell me in the comments. Answer that question if you think it is appropriate to keep killing a man in that circumstance. When he stops breathing, when he stops moving, why is that reasonable to keep killing the man? Just to control the crowd. Like, haha, I don't have to listen to you. I'm a cop, and I am God here. I have full control over life and death. Nothing you can do about it. Ha 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 ha. I mean, I don't get the argument, so again, I know I am very biased in this regard, especially regarding this case. I have very, very strong feelings and very strong opinions about this case. Not to mention just my overall disdain for cops in general, right?
Does that come into play in terms of the use of force, again, based on your training and experience?
Yes.
Such as, what do we know about the location generally, right?
Yes.
Is this a field in the middle of the woods, or is this a higher crime area, right?
Yes.
An officer is evaluating that as a process, as a part of the process involving the use of force. Agreed?
Yes.
You look at other things such as tactical advantages or disadvantages. Agreed?
Yes.
So if you are not able to get what's called concealment or cover, that becomes a question, right?
In what?
Well, in a use of force, you're examining the surrounding area, right? To see if something happens, can I conceal and cover, right?
Yes.
You also, in addition to the scene security, you need to deal with securing the scene, which is different than scene security. Agreed?
Yes.
Scene security is maintaining the safety of everyone around, including yourself and your partners, right?
Yes.
Securing the scene is making sure that the scene itself is preserved and kept tight, right?
Correct. Yes.
And in fact, a police officer's responsibility and part of the use of force determination is to prevent or avoid the use of force against other people. Agreed?
Yes, absolutely.
So if you have to use force against one person to avoid using force against others, that's a factor that an officer should consider. Agreed?
I don't know if I would agree with that.
Okay. Again, within the training department, those people who are, it's their jobs to do that. They may be better to answer those questions?
Yes.
All right. And then even from there, you can widen the lens even further, and an officer will look at his training, right?
Yes.
What he is trained to do or not to do, right?
Yes.
He will look and take into experience, or he or she will take into account his or her own experience from their past career. Agreed?
Yes.
So things like fighting with someone, and what's the probability or possibility that that person is going to continue fighting with you in the future, right? Even after you have them subdued.
I don't know. I don't think I can agree to that totally, but
Okay.
I understand what you're saying.
There are circumstances where after a person is rendered unconscious, and then you perform, you revive that person, that they are more combative than they were initially. Agreed?
Oh, yes. Yep.
And again, in terms of your own past experience, an officer's own past experiences, they're taking that into consideration as well.
Sure.
Now, you testified that you were never, you have never been trained as a Minneapolis police officer to use a knee on the neck of a suspect.
That's correct.
You would agree, however, that in a fight for your life, generally speaking, in a fight for your life, you as an officer are allowed to use whatever force is reasonable and necessary, correct?
Yes.
And that can even involve improvisation, agreed?
Yes.
Minneapolis Police Department policy allows a police officer to use whatever means are available to him to protect himself and others, right?
Yes.
So if there's a paint can sitting on the table and someone is attacking, you can use that paint can as a weapon.
Yes.
And in fact, you have been trained in the prone handcuffing techniques, correct?
Yes.
And it's your testimony that Minneapolis Police Department has never ever trained anyone to put their knee across the shoulder and to the base of the neck?
I didn't say that.
Okay. So you would agree then that pursuant to Minneapolis Police Department training, when they
The guy was already handcuffed. What the hell? Where are you going with that? The man was handcuffed already. He was handcuffed on the other side of the car. And they locked the handcuffs. Just the line of questioning here is mind-boggling.
process of being handcuffed or being restrained, it would be consistent with the Minneapolis Police Department training you've received to place your knee across the shoulder to the base of the neck.
I don't know if I've, part of your question was handcuffing, and we've certainly been trained to put the knee on the shoulder, but I don't know about just restraining a person. I don't recall being trained in that, but.
Okay. Again, possible based on the circumstances.
Sure.
Right? And when an officer is restraining a person and has called for EMS, have you heard the term that we're holding this person for EMS?
Yes.
Okay. And essentially that means you want to keep them in that position until EMS arrives because they're more capable to deal with whatever this situation is. Agreed?
No, I don't think I would agree with that.
Okay. How would you describe the term hold for EMS?
Hold for EMS is that you are holding him for EMS or her.
And sometimes people are held for EMS in a restrained position. Agreed?
Yes, sometimes, yeah.
Now, you also testified that once a person is handcuffed, the threat, I think you said, is gone. It's at the lowest threat level, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, that obviously, a person who's handcuffed can still pose a threat, right?
I suppose they could, yeah.
So an officer who is even though he has someone handcuffed, that person could continue to kick the officer.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah.
That person could continue to thrash his body around. Agreed?
Sure.
And part of the reason police officers restrain people is for that person's own safety. Agreed?
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, it also presumes that the handcuffs were placed on correctly, right?
Yes.
Sometimes in a struggle or an attempt to handcuff someone,
This is going to talk
handcuffs
about
aren't placed on
being
properly and they can
being
pop
locked.
open or be too big for a suspect, right?
Suspect.
In the process of handcuffing someone, one handcuff goes on, thereby giving the suspect a potential weapon.
So we're going to skip this part here. He's again throwing out more hypotheticals of only one handcuff being on, so now it's a weapon. None of that is relevant to this case. Yeah, I don't understand.
And if he were officer, is a dynamic series of decision making based on a lot of different information.
Absolutely.
And it's based upon a lot of information that is not necessarily captured on a body camera. Agreed?
Yes, that's correct.
The body camera is only so effective to show what the body camera sees and not what the officer sees.
That's correct.
And that is why I think Chauvin's going to be testifying in this trial. The only way he can explain the last 4 minutes is if he takes the stand. Nobody else can testify to that. Nobody else can testify to that last 4 minutes of him restraining Miss George Floyd.
Now, in terms of what you did in this particular case, essentially, you would be what's called, are you what's called Car 21? Of this incident back on May 25th of 2020, you understood it to be a critical incident, correct?
Okay, so again, I'm going to pause the video. I'm going to skip around some, skip forward, so I'll be right. Okay, so he just what I just skipped there, so you guys don't think I'm skipping anything important. He just explained that what you actually did on the scene is you made sure that the officers all taped off the scene, and you helped secure the crime scene, right? And he said, or that it was done correctly. And he just said, yeah. All right, so now it's time for the prosecutor to rehabilitate. In some cases, this would rehabilitate the witness. In this case, he wasn't impugned at all. Nothing he said hurt the state's case, in my opinion. And so let's just see some of this. Alright, so this way you guys don't think I'm actually hiding anything. The rest of what his testimony, cross-examination, was just about what the lieutenant did when he got to the scene, and why he was there. He was there to make sure that the crime scene was secured, that they put up all the tape where it was supposed to be, that they were canvassing, talking to witnesses, etc., getting down their names, and just all that information. Not really too important for the purpose of my video. You can always watch this either live, or you can just do a Google search for witness testimony. This one is from the NPR News. So now it's the prosecution's turn to re-examine, and so this would typically be done for clarification, something that the defense asked. Again, the defense can ask a yes or no question. So sometimes the prosecutor will say, oh, no, I want him to expand on that yes or no question. And so that's exactly what this is. So we'll watch some of this.
From
Yes.
officers involved.
Yes.
Did that also capture the bystanders on the sidewalk during the incident?
Yes.
Was there something about that group of bystanders that, in your assessment, was an uncontrollable threat to the officers at the scene?
No.
Would there be a way, or, well, I mean, I ask it this way. Would there be other ways for officers to deal with bystanders?
Yes.
And could that include calling for backup?
Yes.
Would the presence of multiple officers at a scene be a relevant fact for an officer to consider when using an amount of force on a handcuffed and restrained subject?
No, it shouldn't be.
Well, but if there's some concern about the crowd, would it be relevant that there were other officers already at the scene?
Oh, I see. Yeah, no, it doesn't matter, the crowd, as long as they're not attacking you. The crowd really shouldn't have an effect on your actions.
You were asked if the use of force training has changed over time,
Yes,
but you still get the most up-to-date training every year when you go to the use of force training.
I do, yes.
And you were asked about, has the academy changed since you went to the academy?
Yes,
And you haven't been through the academy since then, correct?
right, yeah,
But you have some familiarity with how the academy trains new officers.
absolutely.
And do you think that academy training provides appropriate training for officers
Yes, it should.
and would provide the most up-to-date training on the use of force for Minneapolis officers that take the academy type training?
Yes,
You are a student in the use
Yes.
of force. Based on all the training you go through every year, it's well known that the prone position is dangerous.
absolutely, yes.
Doesn't take a trainer to be able to say that. You've learned it.
Yes,
And that's been something that's been trained repeatedly.
absolutely. That hasn't changed.
You were asked about the critical decision-making model.
Yes,
Familiar with that from your training?
yes,
And part of that is continually reassessing the need for force.
correct.
Is that a fair statement?
Yes,
And so that would include reassessing the location,
yes,
the tactical advantage,
yes,
conceal and cover,
yes,
scene security,
yes,
security and did those videos capture those types of circumstances relative to the restraint of Mr. Floyd?
yes,
And you were able to assess those things in telling the jury what you thought earlier about the restraint of Mr. Floyd?
I am.
When you watched those videos, at some point during the restraint, did you see Mr. Floyd kicking the officers?
No, I didn't.
It may have happened initially, but after that, did you see any kicking?
No, none.
Defense counsel asked you about the concept of holding for EMS.
Yes,
So sometimes it's necessary to keep the person there so they can receive medical treatment.
that's correct.
Does holding for EMS excuse an officer from providing medical attention that they've been trained to provide?
No, it doesn't.
Does holding for EMS excuse officers from continuing to use this decision-making model about the use of force?
No, it doesn't.
Does holding for EMS excuse officers from using other resources like other officers at the scene to
No.
deal with? You were asked about handcuffs. If handcuffs are not, if they're properly connected, can they loosen?
Mhm.
They can come open. But if they're locked, can they still tighten?
That's right.
If they're not, I think the term is double locked.
Right, yes.
And based on your review of the body cams, did you see any need for Officer Chauvin to improvise by putting his knee on Mr. Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
No, I did not.
I have nothing further, Your Honor.
So awesome testimony from this lieutenant, the most veteran person in the police department. Wow. So really quick, I'm going to pull up another video so I can show you guys. And I'm probably going to do this quite often with this one video here. When is it necessary? When should he have removed his knee? If it was appropriate at the beginning, did it become unnecessary? So, okay, so here we go. He's checking the pulse.
Is he breathing right now? Check his pulse. Check his pulse. Check his pulse, Kyle. Kyle, check his pulse.
I couldn't find one. So Chauvin there says what? And then he said, I was checking his pulse right after saying he couldn't find one. So now Chauvin is on notice. Let's see here, 2026-06. That there is no pulse. Let's go ahead and fast forward to when Chauvin is removed from So, 2028-41. So, 3 more minutes after he is told that there is no pulse, he keeps his knee on George Floyd. When is it inappropriate to keep your knee on somebody with no pulse? So, alright you guys, write your comments below. I know that this one is a very hard case to watch. I've watched these videos 1,000 times now, and every time it is still very hard for me, which is why I have never really shown it on my channel before, not these videos. But I think it's important for us to understand. And yes, I thought that the lieutenant's testimony is some of the best we've had yet that were non-emotional testimony. There's been a lot of emotions. This was the best non-emotional testimony yet. So let me know what you guys think. Write your comments down below. Have a great day.